The night was alive with the hum of the city, the streetlights casting long, flickering shadows across cracked pavement. Marcus Carter stepped out of the corner store, the rustle of a plastic bag in his hand breaking the quiet. His broad shoulders and calm demeanor hinted at a man who had seen and endured far more than this neighborhood could throw at him. Dressed in a plain hoodie and jeans, he looked like any other man heading home after a long day. But there was something about his stride, steady, deliberate, unshakable, that suggested there was more to him than met the eye. As Marcus turned the corner toward his car parked under a flickering streetlight, a patrol car crept to a stop nearby. The low rumble of its engine carried through the air like a warning. 2 officers stepped out, their movements sharp and authoritative. One was tall and wiry, his face shadowed under the brim of his cap. The other, shorter but stockier, wore a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Evening," the taller cop called out, his voice flat but laced with suspicion. "Out kind of late, aren't we?" Marcus paused, his gaze shifting from the officers to the patrol car, then back again. He had no reason to worry, he wasn't doing anything wrong, but something about the way they stood, hands hovering near their holsters, set his instincts on edge. He'd learned long ago to trust those instincts. "Just grabbing a snack," Marcus replied evenly, lifting the bag slightly as if to prove his point. His voice was calm, measured, devoid of any challenge. The stockier cop stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "Looks like you're in the wrong part of town for that." Marcus raised an eyebrow, not missing the tension in the air. "Didn't know snacks had a restricted zone," he said, his tone still polite, though a hint of steel underlined his words. The taller cop's smirk faltered. "Let's see some ID." Marcus let out a slow breath, setting the bag carefully on the hood of his car. He reached for his wallet, moving deliberately, every motion deliberate and controlled. He'd been in situations like this before. Not in this context, but in war zones where the wrong move could mean disaster. He handed over his license without a word. The officers studied it, their eyes flickering between the card and Marcus. A subtle change in their expressions didn't go unnoticed by them. They had likely seen his name, but not yet what it meant. "So, what's a guy like you doing here?" the stocky officer pressed, his tone edged with something between suspicion and malice. "Buying snacks," Marcus said simply, his patience wearing thin but his tone remaining calm. He had no desire to escalate this, but he wasn't about to be intimidated either. The taller cop handed back the ID with a deliberate slowness that felt more like a threat than a courtesy. "Why did you pop the trunk for us?" he said, tilting his head toward Marcus's car. Marcus didn't move. His eyes locked onto the cop's, steady and unwavering. "Is there a reason for that?" he asked, his voice low but firm. "Just routine," the officer replied, though the way his hand hovered near his belt made it clear this wasn't routine at all. Marcus clenched his jaw. Memories flickered in the back of his mind, of sandstorms and gunfire, of moments where calm under pressure meant survival. He knew he could handle this, but the question was whether he should have to. "Unless I'm being detained, I'd like to be on my way," Marcus said evenly, his words carefully measured. The stockier officer stepped closer, his smirk returning. "You got something to hide." Marcus looked at him, his gaze steady, unflinching. He could feel the weight of the moment, the tension crackling like static in the air. Every muscle in his body was coiled, not with fear, but with readiness. Because if there was one thing Marcus Carter knew, it was how to handle a fight, though he'd spent years trying to avoid one. And then the taller officer's radio crackled to life, cutting through the standoff. A voice on the other end mentioned a disturbance a few blocks away. The officers exchanged a glance, the momentary distraction enough for Marcus to step back and create space. "Looks like you've got more important things to deal with," Marcus said, his voice calm but edged with quiet authority. He picked up his bag and started toward his car door. But before he could get in, the stockier officer grabbed his arm. It was a mistake, a big one. Marcus froze, the old instincts kicking in. He turned slowly, his eyes locking onto the officers with an intensity that made the man hesitate for just a second. That hesitation was all Marcus needed to take control of the moment. "What happens next?" Marcus said quietly, his voice steady and unyielding, "is up to you." And in that instant, the balance of power shifted, but what would happen next remained uncertain. The officer's grip tightened for a brief second before loosening, but Marcus didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on the cop's, calm and controlled, as if silently daring him to take the next step. The taller officer shifted uneasily, sensing something in Marcus's posture that his partner either hadn't noticed or was too stubborn to acknowledge. "Let him go," the taller one said, his voice lower now, as if he wasn't entirely sure why he was intervening. The stocky officer hesitated, then slowly released Marcus's arm. Marcus stayed still for a moment longer, letting the tension hang between them like a weight neither could ignore. He could see the frustration flicker across the stocky officer's face. Whatever reaction he'd been hoping for wasn't coming. Marcus wasn't about to give them the satisfaction. He nodded slightly and turned away, sliding into the driver's seat. As he started the engine, the officers lingered by their patrol car, watching as he drove off. The air inside the car felt heavier than it should have. Marcus kept his eyes on the road, but his mind lingered on the exchange. It wasn't the first time he'd run into something like this, but the edge in that officer's eyes stuck with him. He'd seen that kind of look before, overseas, in places where authority wasn't always earned but demanded through force. Back then, Marcus was the one keeping the peace, ensuring lines weren't crossed. Now, back home, those lines blurred in ways he hadn't expected. Marcus took a long, slow breath, easing the tension out of his shoulders as the lights of the city stretched ahead. He wasn't angry. Not exactly. It was more a quiet disappointment, the kind that settled deep in his chest. His phone buzzed on the seat beside him. Marcus glanced at it briefly, his sister's name flashing across the screen. He let it ring for a moment before picking up. "Hey, Amanda. You sound weird," she said immediately, skipping over any greeting. "I'm fine," Marcus replied, though the stiffness in his voice said otherwise. Amanda didn't buy it. She never did. "Marcus, what happened?" Marcus hesitated, considering brushing it off, but he knew better. "Just had a run-in with a couple of officers." There was silence on the other end. "Was it bad?" Amanda asked carefully. "Could have been worse," Marcus said, keeping his tone light. "Nothing I couldn't handle." "That's not the point." Amanda's voice sharpened slightly. "This keeps happening, doesn't it?" "It's fine," Marcus repeated, more firmly this time. She sighed, but Marcus could hear the worry sitting just beneath the frustration. Amanda had always been the one to speak her mind, and Marcus respected that about her. Even now, years after he'd come home, she still felt like she had to look out for him. "You know," she said after a moment, "you don't have to keep brushing it off like this." Marcus smiled faintly, though there wasn't much humor in it. "I'm not brushing it off. He trailed off, trying to find the words. "I've been through worse." Amanda didn't answer right away, but he could almost picture the look on her face. Lips pressed together, eyes narrowed with that mix of frustration and concern she always had when he got like this. "Well," she finally said, "you're coming over for dinner this weekend. No excuses." Marcus chuckled softly. "Yes, ma'am." "Bring dessert," she added, her tone lightening. "Got it." Marcus hung up, the faint smile lingering for a second before fading. As he pulled onto the quieter streets closer to home, the tension from earlier began to ease, but not entirely. The encounter had left a mark, a subtle reminder of the things he couldn't fully escape. Marcus had spent years serving his country, deployments in places he rarely talked about, where the stakes were higher and the consequences more severe. But coming home hadn't brought the peace he'd expected. There were different battles here, quieter ones that didn't involve bullets or sand, but they wore on him just the same. His neighborhood was quiet as he pulled into the driveway. The porch light flickered on, casting a faint glow over the small house he bought a few years back. It wasn't much, but it was his, a place where he could breathe, even if the world outside didn't always let him forget. Marcus stepped inside, dropping his keys onto the counter. The house felt still, almost too quiet. He glanced around, the silence pressing in a little heavier than usual. He wasn't lonely, at least. That's what he told himself. But there were moments, nights like this, when the weight of the past felt closer than it should. Marcus made his way to the living room, sinking into the couch with a quiet sigh. His eyes drifted to the old photo on the shelf, him in uniform, standing alongside the men he'd served with. Some of them weren't around anymore. He didn't dwell on it. Instead, he closed his eyes, letting the calm of the room settle around him. But even as sleep crept closer, Marcus couldn't quite shake the feeling that tonight's encounter wasn't over. Because deep down he knew that cop wouldn't let it go. The next morning, Marcus found himself jogging through the neighborhood just as the sun began to rise, casting long shadows over the quiet streets. The rhythmic sound of his feet against the pavement helped clear his mind, but the uneasy feeling from the night before hadn't quite faded. It wasn't paranoia. Marcus trusted his instincts. They kept him alive in places far more dangerous than this. As he rounded the corner near the park, he noticed a black and white patrol car idling by the curb. The same car. The stocky officer was behind the wheel, sunglasses masking his eyes, but Marcus could feel the stare following him as he passed. Marcus kept his pace steady, not giving him the satisfaction of acknowledgement. It wasn't a coincidence. Marcus continued down the path, ignoring the slight tightening in his chest. He wasn't intimidated, but this was something different. The officer wasn't just looking to hassle him. There was something more behind those eyes. When Marcus circled back toward his house, the patrol car was gone, but that didn't bring much relief. He stepped inside, grabbing a bottle of water from the fridge, and leaned against the counter, replaying the encounter in his mind. He thought about calling Amanda, but he knew exactly how that conversation would go. She'd tell him to report it, but Marcus wasn't interested in escalating things. Not yet. Instead, he made his way to the back patio, hoping the quiet of the morning would help push the thoughts aside. But the quiet didn't last long. A few hours later, Marcus was in town, picking up a few groceries when he spotted the officer again. This time, the man was outside a small diner, casually chatting with another cop. Marcus could tell by the quick glance in his direction that he'd been noticed. It wasn't the first time Marcus had dealt with someone who wanted to test boundaries, but the persistence was starting to wear thin. As Marcus placed his bags in the trunk, the officer approached. "Morning," the officer said, his tone overly friendly. Marcus nodded. "Morning. Didn't expect to see you around here again so soon," the officer continued, his voice light but his eyes sharp. "I live here," Marcus replied calmly. The officer leaned slightly closer, his smile thin. "Yeah, I figured. Just keeping an eye on things. Making sure everything's in order." Marcus let his gaze rest on the officer for a moment longer than necessary. "I'd hope so." The silence between them stretched, but Marcus didn't break it. Eventually, the officer gave a short nod and walked back toward the diner, rejoining his partner. Marcus closed the trunk and pulled out of the lot, but the interaction stayed with him. This wasn't over. That evening, Marcus sat in his living room, flipping through channels without really paying attention. The officer hadn't broken any laws, hadn't done anything on paper that warranted a report. But Marcus knew better than to ignore the signs. Old habits were hard to shake. He thought about the men he'd served with, guys who could read a room the second they stepped into it, who could tell when something was off even if nothing obvious stood out. Marcus felt that same itch now. The next day, Marcus decided to pay a visit to an old friend, Detective Paul Grayson, someone he crossed paths with years ago when Marcus first moved back home. Grayson wasn't the kind of guy who brushed things under the rug. The precinct was busy when Marcus arrived, but Grayson waved him into his office without hesitation. "Marcus," Grayson said with a grin. "Been a while, what's going on?" Marcus took a seat across from him. "Ran into one of your officers the other day. Stocky guy, short fuse, keeps showing up around my neighborhood." Grayson's smile faded slightly. "Name?" Marcus shook his head. "Didn't catch it, but I'd know him if I saw him." Grayson leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "I can look into it, but you sure you want to stir this up?" "I'm not stirring anything," Marcus replied. "Just don't like the feeling I'm getting." Grayson nodded slowly. "I'll see what I can find." As Marcus left the precinct, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were only going to get more complicated. The next few days passed quietly, but Marcus didn't mistake that for things settling down. The officer hadn't made another appearance, but Marcus felt the weight of something unseen moving beneath the surface. One evening, as Marcus walked back from a nearby convenience store, he noticed a car parked down the street from his house. Not a patrol car, something unmarked. Marcus didn't stop, didn't change his pace, but his eyes tracked the vehicle carefully. Whoever was inside didn't make themselves known. Marcus unlocked his front door, stepping inside and locking it behind him. He knew the signs. Someone was waiting, watching. And Marcus wasn't about to let them catch him off guard. Marcus kept the lights off as he stood near the window, watching the car park down the street. He shifted slightly, careful to stay hidden behind the curtain. The engine was still running, faint puffs of exhaust drifting up in the cool evening air. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry to leave. He glanced down at his phone, thumb hovering over Grayson's number, but something held him back. Calling would mean explaining more, pulling others into something he still wasn't sure about. Marcus had handled worse things alone. The minutes dragged. Eventually, the car's headlights flicked on, and it rolled slowly down the street. Marcus tracked it until it disappeared around the corner. Only then did he step away from the window, tension settling deep in his chest. He double-checked the locks and walked through the house, every step silent. The night stretched out long, but Marcus didn't sleep much. His mind replayed every encounter, every stare, trying to piece together the parts that didn't fit. By morning, the parked car felt like a distant memory, but Marcus knew better. The quiet wouldn't last. Later that day, Marcus drove into town, eyes flicking to his mirrors every so often. Nothing stood out, but that didn't mean he wasn't being watched. He stopped by a hardware store, grabbing a few things he didn't really need. Old habits. As he paid at the counter, a low voice from behind made him pause. Plan a project. Marcus didn't have to turn to know who it was. The officer stood just a few feet back, leaning casually against a shelf of flashlights. Just keeping busy, Marcus replied, not giving him the satisfaction of looking directly at him. The officer smiled, but there was no warmth behind it. Good to stay busy. Helps keep you out of trouble. Marcus took his bag and turned toward the door, brushing past the officer. He could feel the man's eyes following him all the way to the parking lot. As Marcus climbed into his truck, the officer lingered just outside the store, hands in his pockets. Marcus met his gaze through the windshield, letting the silence speak for itself. The drive home was quiet, but Marcus's focus sharpened. He took different routes, weaving through side streets, occasionally doubling back. If anyone was following, they were subtle about it. That night, Marcus sat on his back patio, watching the stars. The neighborhood felt peaceful, but the tension hadn't faded. A soft creak pulled his attention. Marcus's head turned just enough to catch the shadow moving along the edge of his fence. He rose slowly, stepping silently toward the back door. Whoever it was didn't seem in a rush. Marcus slipped inside, grabbing a flashlight from the kitchen counter, but he left the lights off. He eased the door open and stepped out onto the lawn. The figure near the fence straightened, caught off guard by Marcus' sudden presence. "Something I can help you with." Marcus's voice carried low but firm. The figure hesitated, then stepped forward slightly, hands raised. It wasn't the officer. A younger man, probably in his early 20s, looking nervous under Marcus's sharp gaze. "Sorry, I wasn't trying to trespass," the man stammered. "I live down the street. I thought I saw something." Marcus let him finish, but didn't relax. "You shouldn't be wandering around other people's property at night." "I get it." "Won't happen again," the man said quickly before retreating toward the sidewalk. Marcus watched him go, but something about the interaction felt off. The rest of the night passed without incident, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that more eyes were on him than just the nervous neighbor. 2 days later, Grayson called. "I looked into that officer you mentioned," Grayson said, his tone unusually tight. "There's something you should know. He's been under investigation quietly. A few complaints, excessive force, harassment. Nothing that's stuck yet, but it's piling up." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. "And no one's pulled him off duty?" "Not yet, but it's close," Grayson replied. "Look, Marcus, I know you can handle yourself, but be careful. If he's focused on you, there's a reason." Marcus thanked him and hung up, standing near his kitchen window, watching the street. The officer hadn't shown up again, but Marcus wasn't about to wait for another encounter. He could feel the weight of something coming, something inevitable. That evening, as Marcus stood on his porch, a different patrol car rolled by slowly. This one didn't stop, but Marcus caught the briefest glance of someone watching from inside. He knew the game now, but Marcus had never been one to back down.